everyone, my name is Carole Freeman. I'm the creator of the 90-Day Keto Diet Challenge program, and I'm here today with John DePalma. Thank you for coming.
It's my pleasure, Carole. Great to be here with you today.
Yeah, well, John, will you just start out by telling us who you are?
Sure. Well, currently I teach sport and exercise science at Seattle University. I'm a physical therapist, and I teach courses in metabolic and resistance training, exercise for rehabilitation, responding to emergencies, and I also oversee our internship program for the sport and exercise science undergraduates.
Okay, very cool, which leads us to how I met you in the first place is that you're one of your students, your internees, I guess, I don't know what you would call that.
Sure, our intern.
Okay,
yeah.
Michaela, a student there at your school, is come and working with me now, which I'll be videoing with her shortly, we'll have that, but I thought I'd take advantage of being able to meet you, and turns out your background kind of fits really interestingly with what I'm doing here with everyone.
Yeah, it's a great opportunity to be here, to get to know what you're doing, the service you're offering, and I've been working with Michaela for over a year regarding her interest in nutrition, and it's been wonderful because I've been looking for someone that could be compatible with our program in terms of hosting students. So
yeah, cool.
We're really happy to have this relationship.
Oh, great. Well, yeah. I'm excited to be a part of that because I do love teaching myself. So it's another way I can teach in a non-conventional way too. So, so you have a very diverse career that you're working on now. Can you share with us a little bit of the journey of how you got to where you are now?
Sure, you bet. So backing up quite a few years, I was active in sports in high school. I tended to be a little bit injury prone because I always like to push the envelope beyond my own capacity.
What kind of sports did you?
Well, I was involved in swimming and diving, and played a lot of soccer as well, and did track and field. And so in all of those, and primarily in soccer, that's where I found the most injuries.
Oh. Let's hope it's not diving accidents. Those are bad.
No, I try to stay away from that.
Okay.
I found that I often was rehabilitating my own injuries.
Okay.
And so through that process of kind of undergoing injury, observing the atrophy in my muscles and my limbs that would come about, and then trying to figure out what the best way to rehabilitate myself to get back into sport was, I kind of developed this really fascination with the way my body and all of our bodies work in overcoming injury. And so after high school, I decided I wanted to learn more about the human body and studied human biology. And being that my father's a physician, my mother's a nurse, and I was very interested in sport, I felt like physical therapy was kind of the best combination of those.
Okay.
So I went to physical therapy school at the University of Washington, and I've always had a love for working with athletes.
Okay.
Yet really just love working with all people in general. And one of the best things that I learned in physical therapy school was that once I was out there practicing, that to listen to people and to learn from the people that I work with.
Okay.
Not only other physical therapists, but clients and patients. And so I would say in the 20 plus years that I've practiced, it's those patients who I've really learned the most from about how their body works, what's worked for them, what hasn't worked for them, and that's really informed how I practice and how I have practiced in the past.
I'm sure that people really, really got a lot out of it because I'm sure everybody watching or listening to this has had the experience of like, I don't care what you're telling me, this is the way that this works. This is the way I'm trained to do this, so don't question what I'm telling you.
Right. You know, in our Western medical model, we have a lot of technology at our disposal, and we can tend to rely really heavily on that. The thing is if we don't really take the opportunity to listen to one another and listen to a person's unique experience of an injury or a disability, we're not able to really apply that technology. And so by listening to someone, we actually kind of unlock the door to be able to apply these tools to a person's situation. But we also need to learn the nuances and the specific details of everyone's unique situation, and try not to, or to resist the temptation to categorize injuries, because everybody's situation is so unique and specific to themselves. And so we try to often categorize an injury as a certain category or type. And sure, there are common denominators there. But I think if we look at that as the totality of it, then we're missing out on that person's specific needs. So that was really helpful and instructive for me. So coming out of college, I worked in physical therapy, and I've always had a love for kayaking.
Oh, okay.
And so
you've always lived in the Northwest here?
I grew up in the Northwest.
Okay.
Pretty much I haven't always lived here.
Okay.
Because as my journey goes on, I left for quite a while.
Okay.
But out of college, I went to work for a clinic called the Donaldson Clinic, which was owned by a former pro basketball player named James Donaldson.
Okay.
He, great guy. He played for the Utah Jazz and the Seattle Sonics, and he had had several injuries himself, and so was interested in kind of opening a sports medicine clinic, and so he did that in Mill Creek up north of Seattle.
Okay.
So I worked for his organization for about 2.5, 3 years out of college. And working for him, I moved east of the mountains to Wenatchee, Washington.
It's like a different planet there.
It is. You know, one of the reasons I went was they have about 300 days of sunshine a year, and I love to recreate.
Okay.
So I was able to kind of, in the same day, go mountain biking, skiing, snowboarding, road biking, running, and kayaking if I wanted to, because there are so many options that availed. So I loved the time that I spent there. And during that time, I got really into whitewater kayaking. There was a group of physicians that I used to go with, and we called it Whitewater Wednesday. So we'd usually leave work after noon on Wednesdays and go out kayaking in the whitewater. And so as my story unfolds, I had a couple close calls in the whitewater.
Okay.
As you may know or may not know, whitewater kayaking involves kind of squeezing into a kayak and kind of draping a skirt or an elastic deck over the top that kind of seals one into the kayak. And so on a particular spring day when the river was very high, I got stuck upside down under the kayak. And so that was a pretty harrowing experience. Fortunately, there was another kayaker there who was a nurse that went out on these Whitewater Wednesdays, who he actually was really paying attention and was able to get to me quick enough to help me back up. But that, combined with a couple other close calls, developed my interest in flat water kayaking.
Oh, okay.
And so that's where the rest of the story kind of proceeds, is I started training really at a high level in flat water kayaking. There was a local race in Wenatchee called the Ridge to River, and it was kind of this hallmark race of the Wenatchee Valley that involved relays of teams.
Okay.
So it started on top of the mountain with a cross-country ski leg, to a downhill ski leg, to a running leg, to a biking leg, to a canoe and kayak leg. And so I began training for that. And lo and behold, I got fairly good at it because.
So how many do you run all those legs yourself, or is it a relay, or?
There was an option. People could do one all by themselves or as a team. And so I tended to be very good at kayaking. So I usually put together a team, and kind of aspired to have a team in the top 3 or top 5 every year. And so we would put together teams of often healthcare practitioners who were excellent in one given area.
Okay.
And so my area was kayaking, and so as a result I started competing a lot of times with guys who had been in the Olympic teams that would come and do these races, and I was pretty close to them. And so people started saying, I might want to consider doing that. So I actually looked into it, and in 1998 bought a kind of Olympic racing kayak and tried out for the U.S. long distance team, made the team, went to Hungary, went to Spain, went to France, went to Italy.
Wait, is that your jacket that you brought with you?
Actually, I did happen to be wearing that. Yeah.
Come on, let's show it off. Come on.
I think I got this jacket the year I qualified for the World Championships in
pretty cool.
In '99. Yeah. So that was a really new experience for me. Kind of opened up a whole new world of this competitive kayak racing, going to Europe and competing, and I had the flexibility as a physical therapist to work part-time to support my traveling, and the autonomy to be able to train 2 times a day as needed in order to compete at a high level.
Okay.
So I did that for about 12 years,
All right.
on and off. starting in Wenatchee, eventually moving to Atlanta. There was a training center in Atlanta called Lanier Canoe and Kayak Center. And so I moved to Atlanta, kind of packed my 4Runner with everything I had in it, my kayaks on top, my bikes, and moved to Atlanta. And lived there for 8 years and trained there.
Okay.
And then after that, came back to the Northwest, and that's when I started, actually kind of took a little stint in religious life with the Jesuits.
Oh.
And they're very,
that's
really
an unexpected twist in your
Well,
tale.
I'd been doing a lot of coaching, a lot of mentoring of other people, and a lot of outreach and social ministries. And the Jesuits do two things really well: education and social ministry.
Okay.
And so I was really kind of seeking and very interested in learning more about how they did that. And they have a process of, the other thing they're very good at is spiritual direction and guidance. And so they're good listeners. And so I wanted to learn more about how they interact with people in those three areas. So I was what's called a Jesuit novice. So that took me to Los Angeles, California. And so I spent 2 years learning from them. And during the last 6 months of my time with them, I was required to teach somewhere in a high school or college. And it so happened that Seattle University, where I'm from in Seattle, needed someone in their sport and exercise science program. And so I was able to accept an assignment and a position at the same time in the sport and exercise science program at Seattle University.
Oh, so that's what led you back here then?
Yeah, that's what led me back here.
The loop around the country.
The loop was complete then. That's right, yeah.
Well, so I want to ask you something about the physical therapy industry.
Yes.
What are your thoughts about the movement now? I understand most people working as physical therapists are starting to now be required to have a PhD, whereas you used to be able to work with like a bachelor's degree.
Right.
Yeah.
So actually, it's Carole, it's a DPT.
Okay.
So it's a doctorate of physical therapy, and it's a little different than a PhD, in that a PhD involves a major work.
Like a
major research project. And so and a PhD is a doctor of philosophy in a given area. And so it goes in a little more depth. Whereas a doctorate in physical therapy, it's a clinical degree.
Okay.
So much like, actually the chiropractic physicians were the first, I think, that I was aware of to have this. They have a DC, Doctorate of Chiropractic. And so this movement in physical therapy towards this DPT was very similar, kind of modeled very similarly to the chiropractic doctor. Yeah. So I don't personally have a doctorate in physical therapy. I think it's a great movement, and I've been telling myself for years that I'm going to go ahead and kind of transition into it. Being the competitive athlete that I was and all these other kind of interests I've had, I really haven't taken the time to pursue that independently.
Okay.
But I think it's a good movement in general. I think anytime we have more education in a different area, it only behooves us, it informs us more, and it advances the whole profession. So it's a good thing.
Okay.
Yeah, definitely.
Nice. Well, thanks for sharing that.
Yes.
Now, one of the things that we have talked about before, which was a surprise to me, but the more of these keto chats I do and line up with people, the more synchronous it's become for me, finding people that have had some kind of experience in their diet with fine-tuning their carbohydrate intake.
Yes.
As to optimize their performance or their health and things. And so the same thing happened as I was chatting with you. It turns out that what you found. So tell me about, your...
Sure.
Were you playing with your diet when you were in the Olympics? Probably, right?
I actually, I aspired to make an Olympic team. My challenge was I was very good genetically at long distance. And in the Olympics for kayak racing, the primary mode is sprinting. And so for the long distance, for the anything over 10 kilometers,
here's the bonus cat that I was telling you about. Yeah.
It's
I don't know what she's doing up there, but
the long distance kayak racing is a world championship discipline.
Okay.
So I competed in 7 world championships.
All right.
I went to 4 Olympic trials and had great endurance, but just wasn't fast enough.
Okay.
Was close to being an alternate, but never made the Olympic team. So that was something I had to accept. But I also, in accepting that, accepted the fact that I was very gifted, really, in endurance racing.
Okay.
And so after several years of kind of trying to be a sprinter, really accepted my gifts of endurance and then really started to excel all the more.
Okay.
So during that training, both as a sprinter and as an endurance athlete, I really experimented on my own body. Obviously, my background in biology, physical therapy, I have this kind of innate desire to kind of discern and tease things out in terms of what's truth and what's myth. And so I really did experiment a lot with my diet in terms of what worked the best for my training and competition.
So let's go back to like when you were getting your degree in biology. What was the nutrition dogma at that time? What were you being taught? Well,
part of it was also at the time I was very interested in, as a kind of a college student wanting to develop muscle. And so the prevailing notion then was to, for anybody that wanted to be involved in athletics at that time, to take a lot of amino acids, a little, packet of amino acid supplements.
Branched chain,
Branched chains amino acids, and to take a lot of whey protein, basically. So it was whey protein and amino acids to build muscle. And then, that was in the 80s when everyone was trying to avoid heart disease, so trying to minimize, saturated fats. But in general, protein intake was still important. So there was less discrepancy or less interest in kind of more refined sources of protein.
Okay.
So it was a lot of protein, saturated fats, try to avoid those, and a lot of carbs just for general energy's sake. Although at that point in time, there wasn't really, it really hadn't pinpointed how important it is to either avoid carbs or have carbs for carb loading. The only thing we thought then is if we're going to do an endurance event, eat a lot of pancakes the day before. Basically.
And gel packs during.
Right. Yes. So that was kind of the prevailing ideology at that point in time.
Okay.
Moving forward as an athlete, I began to become more interested in specific workouts and specific strategies and objectives for a given training session. So one training session might be more focused on developing skill. One might be more focused on developing absolute power. One might be more focused on coordination and, say, neurological training. One might be more focused on fat utilization and endurance training, long over distance training. So there were different objectives for different skill or training sessions. And based on those training sessions, I began to experiment with different diets to see which diets favored which sessions.
So where did that even thought that you could, I'm just curious, is it just a tendency you have to kind of go against the status quo maybe? Like what would make you even entertain the idea of like, maybe this isn't quite right what they've been telling us about how to eat. What if I try this other thing that's different? Where did that come from?
I think it is somewhat of an innate curiosity. Again, my father being a physician, my mother being a nurse, there is a bit of scientific inquiry involved in those. Yet, even growing up, I never really wanted to accept that medicine was the cure for something. And especially as a youngster when I was injured and trying to find a way to rehabilitate myself naturally, I always felt like my body had all the answers. And that it was more a matter of trusting my body's innate mechanisms and having faith in finding the way to unlock those innate mechanisms. And that I would say not absolutely anything, but a lot more I believed and always have and still do is possible than we often allow ourselves to believe.
Well, I listened to a TED Talk that came out this morning about the power of the placebo and like all the things we don't understand about just the wanting to get well and better, the power of our mind and our body to do that.
It's amazing, and it's not limited, I don't think, to psychology. I think, and this is where, my interesting path unfolds. The time with the Jesuits taught me as well. There's a spiritual component to this all as well, and I think that it's a matter of this faith in the way our bodies are created, and that we really these bodies are a much more amazing entity than we realize, and so there's this kind of spiritual, psychological, mental, and physical component to allowing our bodies to unfold in a new way that we didn't believe that they could previous to that. Yeah. Whether it's sports performance or health and wellness or injury recovery.
Well, and it ties into what you talked about, how you worked with your client patients about listening to them, right. That belief in them having all the answers, that their body can heal itself. And I wondered if that tied into, not only listening to them, but then telling them to listen to themselves.
Listening to their own body. Yeah. And that's really what I think during that kind of 12 years as an athlete, and then further on in the time that I spent with the Jesuits, was about learning to listen to myself, learning to listen to my body, and letting that kind of lead this kind of walk through a labyrinth, if you will, and letting my body inform me of its needs.
Yeah, what some people call tuition, intuition.
Right.
Tuition. That's a school reference. Tuition.
Sure, right.
Intuition, very different than tuition. But some people might call that like, spirit or God speaking with them.
Definitely.
Or a lot of different ways of looking at that.
We can call it, clairvoyance or insight, intuition. We get these epiphanies. And so those come, I believe, they come from within. Yeah.
Well, and just the language that we use around that. I got a gut feeling,
Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
Right.
So as I experimented with diet, I found that I was especially interested in this concept of fat utilization, because in sport, at least in kayak training, repetition of good form, almost perfect form, makes for more efficient movement.
So give us a time for, what decade was this that you were...
So I really embarked on it in 1998 was kind of the beginning.
Okay.
And I actually went on until 2012, so it was really 14 years altogether.
Okay.
Yeah, that I was very seriously engaged in competitive kayaking.
Okay.
Yeah. And so I found that my own theory, my own philosophy was that repetition was necessary, and that in developing new movement patterns, new engrams, if you will, that repetition in a given session was very important to try and kind of learn a new pattern within a session as much as possible. And so therefore, long distance was necessary. And so in order to fuel my body for long distance, that's when I started experimenting with more kind of natural fat diets, eating a lot of peanut butter, basically, a lot of avocados, a lot of things that were unsaturated fats, basically, and not being afraid of this myth of, too much fat would make me fat.
Yeah. Okay.
And obviously, at this point, I was, going out kayaking for 2, 3, 4 hours at a time.
Yeah.
And so
you probably had a hard time getting enough calories.
Calories were really important. Yeah. So the kind of the more unsaturated fat, the better, really. Yeah.
So how did you notice your performance change as you started incorporating more fat?
Well, I noticed that I could go longer in those sessions with a higher quality of movement.
Okay.
Is what it really was. I was able to stay focused without being distracted by fatigue or kind of discomfort that can often come. A lot of times in a 2.5-hour kayak training session, it's more of the just general discomforts of being in that position and kind of the repetitive movement that could cause one to kind of bail out early.
Okay.
But I noticed with that kind of more fat in the diet, I was just able to keep going longer and didn't seem to be nagged as much with discomforts.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's pretty cool. And So then, were you just eating a higher fat for all your meals and snacks a day, or did you find that timing that affected it at all? Or?
I really didn't narrow it down to an acute window of timing. I just made sure with each meal and in between meals. So it was kind of more of a grazing effect, really.
Okay.
Yeah.
Did you have anybody at that time that was questioning what you're doing, telling you were crazy, you needed to eat pancakes before you went out and paddled for 3 hours? Or
trying to think back, I had a number of coaches, and most of my coaches were really big on, whey protein still, and animal-based protein, which I definitely, had a lot of that. Although, again, for animal-based protein, as I listen to my body, I seem to kind of have this affinity to gravitate towards fish as a source of protein, particularly salmon, steelhead, cod, tuna. These are fish that are substantial. They have a lot of meat on them, I guess you could say. Like a tuna steak. So. The rest of the coaching staff and the athletes were usually eating, beef, which I'm not opposed to. But personally, I felt that kind of gravitating more towards fish, plant-based diets, plant-based fats was just better for me.
Felt better for you.
It felt better for me.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, what an ultimate example of listening to your body and what feels good and right and fuels you.
Yeah, it really was. And as far as, carbs go, again, I felt that if I ate too much carbs, it made me really lethargic. And that's the other thing, that with the higher fat content in my diet, I wasn't feeling lethargic a lot of the time. And so that was a difference too. In terms of trying to get to each training session, it can be a real struggle. We think about these folks who are in the Olympics every 4 years and how dedicated they are, but not until you're really there do you really realize that sometimes just to get to a training session, it's kind of a challenge because it's a tiresome process. And your body is constantly recovering. And that's another thing that I felt was recovery time was enhanced with the presence of the higher fats. It seemed to give a little bit more of a, I would say it allowed my body to be more forgiving in terms of recovering from high intensity workouts.
Perhaps like we were talking about before we turned the recording on was the reduction in inflammation that you get with that proper fat balance. Probably helps.
Yeah, I think there's this reduction in inflammation, which definitely is a huge factor in recovery from a high intensity workout. I also think that in some of the high intensity sessions, this neurological learning that goes on, I think that the fat can be beneficial because, as we know, the structure of the nervous system itself, the myelin sheath that surrounds the nerve and allows for higher conductivity is largely made of fat.
Right.
And so I just, it's sheer speculation, but I don't wonder, it would be interesting to conduct some research really and have, a group of athletes that's doing high intensity power output, neurological demand, and look at their diets in terms of high and low fat content and see if there's any differences in recovery time and ultimate performance.
Yeah.
The other thing I was going to mention too is not only did I find this helpful in sports performance, but I think that also when we talk about injury recovery, that recovering from an injury is something that takes a lot of energy to do. And a lot of times it's not a high demand for a high output all at once, but a need for low, constant energy output. And again, the most appropriate fuel for that kind of output is fat.
Yeah,
really.
That's a great point. Like long distance recovery.
Right. And so when a person is trying to go about their everyday activities of daily living with an injury, it takes more energy than it would otherwise.
Yeah.
And so I think that this kind of diet can be helpful for somebody that is in an injury kind of status that needs that extra energy, not only to get through their activities of daily living because they're less efficient now with an injury, but actually to have the energy for healing, to fuel the healing process. So I think that's a really important thing to consider as well.
I like that perspective. That's really cool. Yeah. So I was gonna ask you about like family history. Do you what's the history your family's health like? Do you have any predispositions towards anything or?
So my grandfather, he died of a heart attack.
Okay.
So he had heart disease, obviously. And my father has had his bouts with heart disease as well.
Okay.
So we're aware that, familially, we have a history of heart disease and high cholesterol.
Okay.
And so I've personally experimented a lot with that as well.
Okay.
Looking at cholesterol levels.
Yeah.
How that may alter my performance as well as my lab tests.
Okay.
And how my diet can inform that.
Yeah. Well, share. I'm so excited to hear this.
So actually, when I went to France in 2003, I went to France, which was kind of a staging ground for me whenever I was going to compete in Europe because I had good friends on the French team. And
so I got to know, as part of the training regimen there, like baguettes and brie for breakfast and wine and coffee and
definitely it's the French know how to eat well. And so usually breakfast, we often had, baguettes with Nutella.
Okay.
Nutella, with boiled milk. So hot milk.
Okay. Whole milk maybe.
Whole milk usually, yeah. Eggs, cheese. Lunch, was a typical full meal usually. Often very rich in dairy. And then dinner was kind of more of the same.
Okay.
Definitely, we usually had a glass of wine with dinner. And so dessert usually followed. If we're athletes, we're burning calories, we can kind of eat whatever we want, basically. So I had gone to France and spent a month in France, was training very vigorously and eating the typical French diet. I was performing quite well, but when I came back for my standard health screening, had my cholesterol tested, and I think it was around 240 was my total cholesterol. Now, mind you, I had been training at a very high level.
Yeah.
So my HDL level was really high.
Okay.
So that elevated everything.
Well, yeah, and we know that's more important now than what the total number is.
That's right. So, but my LDL was still much higher than it normally would. So being that my father had a history of heart disease, my grandfather had passed from a heart attack, my physician wanted to put me on medication for cholesterol levels. And I said, well, let's try a little experiment here.
Yeah.
Why don't I try my own diet now that I'm back from France, and I'll come back in 4 to 6 weeks, and let's recheck my cholesterol.
Well, and by typical standards, most doctors or physicians would say, like, that's not enough time to make any changes.
Right,
so,
that's exactly what he said. He said, well, it's not enough time, but we'll see.
We'll humor you.
Yes. So I went home that day, and I said, okay, I'm going to fast for 5 days. So I drank water for 5 days to cleanse my body completely.
Yeah.
So I just cleansed my body, and then I went with primarily a plant-based and fish-based diet, basically. And with the plant-based diet, there were a lot of fats involved. Because again, I was decreasing my consumption of carbs, of animal fats, of proteins, and so I wanted to, of beef, basically.
Okay.
So I was basically getting a lot of protein through fish and through natural sources.
Like nuts and seeds and avocados you were mentioning. Yeah.
Yes. And so my natural fats were quite high. So I did that it was about 5 weeks.
Okay.
Went back, and my physician was astonished when my cholesterol level, I think, I still have the records, but I know it was lower than 160 total cholesterol. But I want to say it was close to 140 total cholesterol. And my HDL was nearly as high as my LDL at that point in time, because I had still been exercising very vigorously. Yeah.
Well, it sounds like you found some keys to hopefully good health for yourself for the long term.
It was amazing, actually, but it really showed me and my physician how incredibly malleable these bodies we have are.
Yeah.
That there is a lot more that can change than we realize, or that a lot of times conventional science even will allow us to realize.
Well, and you did a couple of things that are really powerful, and what you mentioned about the fasting. Are you familiar with Dr. Jason Fung?
No, I'm not.
He's actually he's pretty prominent in the ketogenic community, because he advocates fasting a lot of times for people that really have really resistant insulin resistance. Or people that really just want to get a jump start on a fat fast or a fat adapted state. And so he really is a big proponent of fasting. And then he and Jimmy Moore right now are working on a book that's coming out in the fall about fasting and the power of that. So
I'll have to look for that. I'm fascinated by this concept of fasting. And again, I think we need to be cautious and not undertake things to an extreme level that would compromise any pre-existing health conditions. But I think in terms of producing a change in our metabolism, that's kind of this transition window that if we can, even 1 to 3 days fast, it really allows our metabolism to, it's kind of like hitting that reset button on our metabolism. And then introducing the ketogenic diet or a new diet after fasting, our body is more responsive, I believe.
Yeah, there's a lot of talk, and I think some research too, on the autophagy and the hormesis effect of that stressor on the body, and how it can be such a positive impact on supporting DNA repair and things like that. So it's a new area with a lot of.
I think it does have a lot of potential for health and wellness and longevity.
Yeah.
And again, obviously, as a person from a scientific background, I think research is really important, and we can't just take testimonials as the end all and be all. So we need to look through the literature, comb it, and support scientific studies. And some of the studies I've read, actually, that I've really been interested in, promote actually as extreme as eating every other day. So taking a day off to allow the digestive tract to kind of heal, and to finish digesting the food we ate the day before. So there's a lot to be learned about kind of thinking out of the box and maybe going just a little bit out of our comfort level, but I think our bodies can really respond in turn.
Yeah. Well, and I know some people watching or listening to this right now, hearing the idea of going without food for an entire day sounds like the most torturous thing they could ever think of. And wait, aren't we supposed to eat every 2 to 3 hours? How could you advocate that, or how could you even endure that? And I found pretty universally, if people are really dependent on carbohydrates, if they're still in that carb burning state of their metabolism, especially people that are insulin resistant or have diabetes or that family history, it's really, really hard for them to be able to fast, even a couple of hours. Whereas somebody like you that had that metabolic flexibility, you were adapted to burning more fat, and then you had, sounds like with your French diet, it was probably a little higher in carbohydrate, and you had that flexibility. And so for you to do a 5-day fast, it probably wasn't as hard as somebody who, you know, is just still challenged. And so I've found, and I used to be somebody as well, I was that person like, go without food, how could that possibly ever happen? And so I've definitely found as my body has become fat adapted, so I've been doing ketogenic diet for almost 11 months now, and it's so much easier to go 6, 12, 20 hours without eating and not be starving or hungry and angry at the same time. And so for anyone that's listening or watching and you just think that's a crazy talk, like, get to the point where you're fat adapted, and then you can experiment with those things. It's much easier, and then you can experiment with some health benefits for yourself.
You brought up an important point, and the thought that occurred to me is, this is a strong word, addiction. But if we think about, you know, people that are addicted to substance, if a person's addicted to alcohol or some other substance, their body is going to go through severe withdrawals in the absence of that chemical. It's a chemical dependency.
Right, because addiction involves, most people think of addiction as like in the brain.
It's a physiological mechanism.
It's two components,
So the cells crave.
They're dependent on it.
They're dependent on it. They have metabolically adapted to utilize this new substrate in a way that they think that they need that for survival.
Right.
And so a person will go through horrible withdrawals after being deprived of that chemical.
Yeah. And not only your body cells, but the gut biome, the bacteria in your gut are dependent on that as well.
Right. Yeah. So when it comes to our diet, if we're dependent on carbohydrates and we don't even know it, and we decide we're going to fast for 6 hours, in that 4th hour, our body is going to be crying out for carbohydrates.
Right.
And so we might not even realize how dependent we were on it until we get to that 4th hour. And it's a physiological need in a way, because that's what our body has become dependent on as an energy source to metabolize and to produce energy. And so it's a need of the body at that point in time. And that's where, you know, the question about listening to our body, it's not always straightforward, right? When do I listen to my body? When do I not listen to my body? Because
my body used to tell me that I needed to eat cake every day, but it was wrong.
Right. So we have to temper some of those desires our body gives us and keep them all in the context of the big picture. So I think that, you know, whether it's a 4-hour fast, an 8-hour fast, a 12 or a 24-hour fast, it's a great way to, one, be more aware of what we might be more dependent on than we thought we were, but also to help reset our body's physiological mechanism for metabolizing to be renewed, really.
Yeah, and with becoming keto adapted, there's several phases you go through. The first 3 days is kind of getting over that carb withdrawal, the physiological withdrawal of that. I mean, a lot of people don't realize that our body's not very good at storing carbohydrates. We have, you know, a 3 to 5 day supply if we're eating nothing else, and then it has to turn to fat. Whereas our fat storage, even on somebody as lean as you probably have 3 weeks. I'm just estimating, but 3 weeks of supply of fat.
We have more than we think we do.
Yeah.
We definitely do.
Yeah. So it's much more efficient storage mechanism for calories, and once you can get your body adapted to that other energy state, you have a much steadier supply that gives you that, what you were sharing about in your training, about the clarity of mental focus and less, better energy for your muscles as well, too, long term.
Definitely. Yeah.
Well, gosh, this has been really fun. Is there anything else that you were hoping we would talk about, or anything else you wanted to share about yourself, your journey? Or
You know, the journey goes on, and we're always discovering new aspects of ourselves, of the human body. But I think the most important thing is that we really, one, listen to our body the best that we can on a consistent basis. And so that's where I think journaling really is important too. To journal kind of how we're feeling in conjunction with what we're eating. And again, then this exercise picture, to be realistic too, and to listen to our body when it comes to exercise output. And I think the thing is, we're often shaped by culture based on how we eat and how we exercise, rather than listening to our body and its needs for what we ought to eat and how we ought to move. I think a lot of times, again, this whole movement away from fat altogether, right, to have the perfect body, okay? And a lot of the exercise industry has also been geared toward how to sculpt the perfect body. When really we want to be happy more than anything. And I think if we listen to our body in terms of what to eat and how to play when we exercise, I think that brings about kind of a more natural, motivating, inspiring outlook. Yeah. So that's the last thing I'd say, and maybe that's a talk for another time. Is kind of this whole how we go about exercising and what our motives are for doing that.
Yeah, that would be a fantastic follow-up, because I've really found that when people are in a fat storage mode in their body, they actually have less energy. And I noticed that for me and a lot of people I've talked to, is that once that I got through that and got over on the fat burning side, was that I actually had tons of energy and I wanted to go walk and I wanted to be active for the first time ever. And so a lot of people hear that and they're like, you don't understand, like I know it's good for me, but I just don't have any energy to go do anything. And so there is hope. You get your metabolism healthy, you can actually, listen to what it says better, right? Like same thing with like listening to what foods it wants to eat when you're metabolically healthy. You can also listen to what it wants for activity and
that's exactly
fun and movement.
Yeah. Right.
It's hard when your body's not well. It's hard to listen to any of the signals that it's sending.
And so the last thing I would say is we part. Carole, it's been wonderful chatting with you. It just brings up so much memories and so much inspiration to continue to kind of experiment with myself.
Oh, great.
I do think this kind of building time into our schedules, whether it's 5 minutes a day or 15 minutes a day, to be still, to be quiet, and to be silent in a way that we can listen to our bodies and listen to ourselves, and that we can reflect over the patterns we've been engaging in and see them more clearly. And so that's the last thing, is I think kind of trying to live less frenetic lives and creating more space in our lives for that kind of reflection allows us to follow the innate wisdom of our bodies more easily.
Yeah, take a couple minutes to turn off the stress light switch in your body and relax. Yeah.
So
that's great. That's a fantastic message. So, well, thank you, John, for being here. This has been really great, and I appreciate your time, and I think everybody probably enjoyed listening to you as well. So
my pleasure.
Yeah, all right. Well, thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time. Bye.
Thank you.